Hello class! Today we're going to discuss the puzzle of material constitution. Let's see what that's made of. Here's some study guide questions to help us get started. 1. What is the puzzle of material constitution? 2. What does the puzzle of material constitution crucially involve? 3. Which 4 assumptions, according to Cider, lie behind the puzzle of material constitution? 4. How did these 4 assumptions lead to a contradiction? 5. How should we aim to solve the puzzle of material constitution? Okay, as always, as I give the answers to these questions throughout the video, you'll want to pause the video and write them down, type them up, crochet them into a sweater, hammer them into an ice sculpture, or do something to facilitate your memory of them. The puzzle of material constitution is a very ancient puzzle in the history of philosophy, and it's quite easy to explain. In fact, if you have any personal friends who specialize in philosophy, they've probably already told it to you at some time or another. The puzzle of material constitution concerns our idea of what a material object is. We tend to think that we live in a world of matter, everything around us is made of matter, whatever that is, and that objects are the things in the world which are made of matter. Now the puzzle arises from a certain tension which lies between, on one hand, our notion of what a material object is, and on the other hand, this idea we have about material objects, which is that they, well, spatially exclude one another. We have this intuition that you can't have 2 distinct material objects in exactly the same place at exactly the same time. And the puzzle arises when we consider some counterexamples. Let's consider one of the most common examples now. Here there is a coffee mug. And also, here there is a hunk of ceramic, a portion of ceramic. Now at first we might think, the ceramic is the coffee mug. The coffee mug just is a hunk of ceramic. That's a very sensible way to think. This coffee mug is nothing but a hunk of ceramic. But if I were a sufficiently destructive person, and if I had the right tools, I could subject this to an incredible amount of heat, melt it down into a puddle, and it would still be the same hunk of ceramic. The hunk of ceramic would be there, although the coffee mug would not. I would have destroyed the coffee mug. If it was your coffee mug, you would have cause for grievance. I would have destroyed something that belonged to you. I would have destroyed the coffee mug, but I wouldn't have destroyed the hunk of ceramic. That proves, or seems to prove, that the coffee mug is not the hunk of ceramic. You can have one without the other. You could destroy the coffee mug, yet leave the hunk of ceramic behind. Well, if the coffee mug is not the hunk of ceramic, then they are distinct. They're 2 distinct things, and yet here we have them in the very same spot. 2 distinct things in the very same spot, the coffee mug and the hunk of ceramic? That's the puzzle. We can't have 2 things in the very same place at the very same time, and yet, wherever there's a material object, it seems like we do. There's nothing special about ceramic and coffee mugs, of course. You could consider the fruit and the tissue from which the fruit is made. This is a piece of fruit, and where the fruit is, there's also a collection of tissue, some cells that make up the peel and the rind and the actual fruit of the piece of fruit. So you might think, yes, the fruit is just a hunk of tissue. That's all it is. The fruit is nothing but a hunk of tissue. And yet, if I were sufficiently destructive, or perhaps I'm about to make something really delicious, I could chop up the fruit, thereby destroying the fruit. I've destroyed the fruit, but the tissue would remain. Or consider the cat, or the kitten, and the cat tissue that it's made from. You wouldn't say normally that the cat is just a hunk of cat tissue. One of the reasons why, of course, is that you could destroy the cat if you killed it or did something horrible to it, but the cat tissue could still remain behind. A cat is more than a hunk of cat tissue. Or perhaps most famously, you've got the statue and the stone. At first you might think the statue just is a hunk of stone. That's all the statue is. This is just a hunk of stone. But if you had sufficient means, you might warp the stone to the point where the statue is destroyed. Bend it, melt it, smash it to rubble, and then fuse it together again. you could certainly destroy the statue without destroying the stone. Again, an argument for the claim that they are distinct, the statue and the stone. And if they're distinct, then we have two things in exactly the same place at exactly the same time. In general, you might think of the puzzle of material constitution as a thing-stuff problem. That wherever you have a thing, there's some stuff of which it's made. And that hunk of stuff is an object unto itself. So it looks like wherever it seems like you only have one material object, you actually have two. You don't just have the statue, you have the statue and the stone from which it's made. You don't just have the kitty cat, you have the kitty cat plus the hunk of cat meat that makes it up. You don't just have the fruit, you have the fruit plus the hunk of living tissue. You don't just have the coffee mug, you've got the coffee mug and the hunk of ceramic that's located exactly where it is. And so on. Now, for our discussion of this puzzle, we're actually using a chapter from Riddles of Existence, A Guided Tour of Metaphysics, edited by Earl Connie and Ted Sider. We're looking at the chapter called Constitution, written by Ted Sider, and we're going to use Sider's own example and formulation of this puzzle in order to discuss it and the various views you might adopt in order to try to solve it. Ted Sider uses the example of a clay statue and the hunk of clay from which it's made. Rather than giving the assumptions mere numbers, assumption 1, assumption 2, assumption 3, assumption 4, that gets boring, Sider does something nice that philosophers sometimes do, which is name the assumptions. Give the assumptions memorable names, so that way we remember what they are. In this case, Sider presents the puzzle of material constitution as an inconsistent tetrad. That is, a collection of 4 assumptions, each of which seems plausible, and yet together they lead to a contradiction. Since they lead to a contradiction together, at least one of them has to be wrong, and the game of philosophy in this case is to decide which one of these is the wrong one, and to take up the defense of denying that article of common sense. Sider names the assumptions creation, survival, existence, and absurdity, and they go like this. Creation. Creation is the assumption which says that when the hunk of clay is sculpted, it creates a statue which did not exist before the hunk of clay was sculpted. That's important. The assumption of creation, in other words, says that the statue did not always exist, it came into existence, and it came into existence when the clay was sculpted. Then there's the assumption of survival. The assumption of survival says that sculpting the hunk of clay does not destroy the hunk of clay. The hunk of clay survives being sculpted. Sculpting the hunk of clay doesn't obliterate it or drive it out of existence. It's still there even after the statue has been created. The third assumption, existence, is a little more general. The assumption of existence says that there are such things as statues and hunks of clay in general. That, in general, it's possible to have things that are made up of other things. That's what the existence assumption asserts. That it's possible to have things made up of other things. Things like statues, hunks of clay, fruit, hunks of tissue, cats, hunks of cat meat, tables, wood, coffee mugs, ceramic. Those things all exist. And finally, we have the assumption of absurdity. This is the assumption which says, well, you can't have two material objects in the same place at the same time. That's the assumption of absurdity. And it's meant to articulate our sort of intuition or our ordinary common sense judgment that that's how material objects work, that they can't be co-located, that they exclude one another in some sense, that you cannot have two things in the same place at the same time, that is true. So let's take a look at all 4 of those assumptions. We've got sculpting the hunk of clay creates a statue which did not exist before the clay was sculpted. Sculpting the hunk of clay does not destroy the hunk of clay. Things like statues and hunks of clay can exist, and yet you can't have two things in the same place at the same time. Together, those 4 assumptions imply a contradiction, which is unacceptable. We hate contradictions. We're allergic to them. We're contradiction phobic in philosophy. Unless we're talking about the philosophical issue of contradictions themselves, in which case, another video, another class, in fact. But those 4 assumptions do lead to a contradiction. We say, you can't have 2 things in the same place at the same time, and yet, here is a hunk of clay. When we sculpt it, it creates a statue where the hunk is, the hunk remains, and there can be such things as hunks of clay and statues. Therefore, despite our initial assumption that you can't have 2 things in the same place at the same time, here is one thing in a place, and here is another thing in that same place at the same time. Contradiction. So how do we solve this? How do we get out of this? Well, what we do is we decide which one of these assumptions we want to disagree with. And we take a look at what disagreeing with that assumption entails, and we embark on the task of defending everything that's entailed by our denial of that assumption. Maybe we want to get out of the puzzle by denying the creation assumption. In other words, maybe we want to get out of the puzzle by saying, hey, nothing was really created when the hunk of clay was sculpted. The statue really is just the hunk of clay, which always existed. That would be the just matter theory, which we'll get into next time. Or maybe we want to deny the assumption called survival. Maybe we want to say that once you sculpt the hunk of clay, there is no hunk of clay anymore. It's just a statue. The hunk of clay is gone. There is no hunk, just the statue. That would be what we call the takeover theory, or rather what Sider calls the takeover theory, and we'll discuss that soon too. Or maybe you're just fed up with statues and hunks of clay and fruit and hunks of tissue and cats and cat meat and all that stuff. Maybe you just want to say, no, there's no such things as material objects. There's just particles, just tiny particles, and sometimes they form shapes, and other times they dissolve, but at no point are there any such things as tables and chairs and statues. Oh, no, 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 no. I deny that there are such things as hunks of clay and statues. Maybe you want to do that, and deny the assumption called existence. Or finally, maybe you want to take a lesson from all of this and just say, hey, I guess we've learned something from all these weird cases. When we thought you can't have 2 things in the same place at the same time, we were wrong. Turns out you can. It's just that you only can in certain cases and in certain circumstances, but hey, you still can. You can have 2 things in the same place at the same time. I deny absurdity. That would be another way to try to solve the puzzle. Regardless of which way you prefer, that's how you solve the puzzle, is you pick one of these assumptions which you think is the wrong one, and you do your best to maintain a denial of it in the face of objections. And that's what's called making a philosophy. Again, philosophy starts with puzzles and attempts to solve them. So we'll return looking at a few different bits of philosophy about material constitution, beginning with what Sider calls the just matter theory. I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.